very first episode of the Weathering Together podcast. This podcast series is going to be just one element of the Weathering Together community that I'm launching with hopes of helping us all better understand just the importance of meaningful relationships, meaningful connection in our lives. Over the last several years, I've been on this work journey, this personal journey that has helped me really understand the greatest predictor of our overall wellness in life is the quality of the relationships that we have in our life. And so I think when we look at really just some of the unhealthy trends that we have going across our culture and in this country, we have a sad suicide epidemic going on. We have this drug overdose epidemic going on. There's a lot of research that tells us that people are caught up in really what can only be described as a loneliness epidemic. And I've said it over and over. What we really have going on in this country right now is a hurting epidemic. And I really believe a lot of that hurting is tied to the lack of connection, the lack of relationships that we have in our lives with one another. And so this community that I'm going to launch, I hope will promote meaningful connection in our lives. I hope it will grow meaningful connections in our lives. I hope it will highlight relationships. I hope it will teach about relationships. And I hope it will, in just this small community, draw us into relationship and community with one another here at Weathering Together. So today's episode is, again, the very first one, the very first interview that I'm doing as a part of this podcast. And I'm interviewing my friend, my colleague, just an absolutely wonderful young woman, Marrin Scalone. So you'll hear more about my connection with Marrin and how that came to be. It's a little bit of an interesting story itself. But I'm interviewing Marrin today because Marrin is the survivor of youth suicide. And as I've done a lot of work across the state this last year, that is one sad theme that keeps coming up in community after community, the reality of young people taking their life through suicide and the reality of even more young people attempting to do so. And I think our young people are in this sort of sad place in their lives where they're overwhelmed with hopelessness. They're overwhelmed with just this lack of being able to see where they fit in this world. And this is a place where Marrin has been in her life several years ago. So no better person to really talk about how she got there, talk about how she has survived it. And really more important is what are some of the things that she's doing today as a survivor to, one, keep her own health in a good place, and two, work with all of us to find our own healthy place. So I am going to turn this over now to this conversation that I had with Marrin Scalone. All right. Well, I want to welcome my friend and colleague, Marrin Scalone, this is the first interview of this new podcast I'm starting, Weathering Together. Hopefully, by the time we're done with this conversation, folks will have a better idea of what we mean by weathering together, and maybe a good idea why you are the first interview in this sort of new direction that I'm going. I did a podcast for years, which is a lot about running. But, if I think back on it, a lot of that focused on how running brought people together. So it's not really as divergent as it may seem. But so let me tell folks a little bit about our story, Marrin, how you came to be here today. I personally don't think any of it's an accident that, the moment we first met, I look back on that, and now here we are today. It just seems like a sort of guided path. But I was sitting on an interview panel. I guess it's been about a year ago now, or I don't even know how long it's been.
feels like 7. No, I'm just kidding. I really do. I think it was May or June. So not even.
Not even a year.
Mhm.
So I was sitting on a interview panel for a job that you are not doing right now. It was a different position in our office,
Yes.
and I was invited to be on the interview panel. And you interviewed, and you started giving answers to some questions. And I should say, I guess I should introduce you as a little. I'm going to back up a little bit. Tell us your role in life right now, before I finish my piece. Just tell us a
Okay.
little bit about you.
Role in life, that's a big statement. But a little about me is my name's Marrin Scalone. I am currently I feel like sometimes a professional young person and a professional not young person. But I'm currently finishing up my bachelor's degree in psychology, and I stumbled into DBHDS last year, that Keith will tell in a moment. But I've started working with him in this adverse childhood experiences work and with the state in some really meaningful and ways that I'm really grateful for, that I didn't expect to get this opportunity at this part of my life. So that's a little bit about where I am at in the journey of heading towards psychology, towards something professional in the mental health field. And that is a little cloudy as well of what that title will be, but all of it sort of coming together into where I'm at the moment. Is that good?
That was the perfect backstory. That's what I needed to get
Perfect.
to. Professional young person, because as we were in, so I'm going to go back to, so we're sitting in this interview and you're giving these answers, and I'm thinking 2 things really. Like, one is she can't possibly be as young as her resume advertises her to be, because she is speaking much older than she is. And the other thing I started thinking is that, now wait a minute, I have this job over here that I'm soon going to be hiring to support me in this work we are doing across the state in adverse childhood experiences. And the more you talk, the more I'm thinking she's interviewing for the wrong job. And so we got done with that interview, and I immediately texted our boss and I said, you know what I'm thinking about Marrin, don't you? And she said, yes, you're thinking you need her to fill that role for the job you have open. I said, is it okay if I email her? And we did. I emailed you, and now you have been working. I don't for a second ever think of it as you work for me. We work together on some real meaningful work, and you have added as much to my professional and personal life as I could have ever even begun to dream of. And part of that has led us to this conversation today. Because really what we're going to do for the next however long we spend together here is do what you and I have done a lot of, and that's just talk about certainly work, but then that always ends up to drilling down to life and people and relationships and just how to do those in a healthy way for one another, which gets back to this whole idea of weathering together. So a couple of weeks ago, you and I were having one of these discussions about just the, nature of some of the hurt and challenges that are going on across our state, because you and I both get to spend a lot of time talking to people across the state. But we were talking about youth mental health, and in our community and in the greater community, how certainly this pandemic has been a challenge for them, but challenges really that predated the pandemic. I think my opinion is the pandemic did far more to expose the magnitude of the struggles our young people were already having, more than it did to cause them, as much as I'll say there's both have been a factor in that. But we were talking then specifically, and one of the things I want to say before we go any further down this road is that, mental health and youth mental health is a heavy topic. For some folks, it's much heavier than others, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit. So I want folks to know we are going down this road. We're going to talk about mental health. We will be talking about suicide. As tragic and as hard as that conversation is, it's important to have it. The other thing, I think we would both agree, and I'll let you add anything to sort of this forewarning or this, upfront preparation, that, neither you or I would consider ourselves, I don't think, experts in terms of giving folks advice. What do I do about this? We're going to talk about youth suicide. There are a lot of parents. I'm a dad. I've got 13 and 15-year-old boys. This is a heavy topic for me to talk about. We are all inclined to want to know, what is this thing I need to do to protect my family from a tragic outcome like that? And I think we would both agree that there is no recipe for that. There is no, here is the path to protection. I think that's because every young person's story is really, really different. Every environment that they're in is really, really different. And so I think you and I are having this conversation because we believe there's power in story. We believe there's power in shared experience. And in doing that, people can hear the struggles and hurts of someone else and maybe find something within themselves in that story that becomes helpful. And at the end, we will talk about, there are resources out there. There are things we can do that are generally helpful protective factors. But I just wanted to say up front, like this I hope will not come across as advice. I hope it won't come across as finger pointing. I hope it won't come across as shaming or blaming. Some of the things that really happen in these discussions, I think you and I are both committed to not go there. And anything you want to add to that, Marrin?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that that's always the complicated nature of talking about these things, especially, as sensitive as it is and as much as that can be. But as you said, I would take it as, allow this to engage curiosity and exploring further resources, that this shouldn't be a resource in terms of that knowledge and information, but it's also by no means a substitute and a supplement. Hearing what we're going to be speaking about and just a dialogue and a little bit about my personal and professional kind of stories is not a substitute for equipping yourself and engaging in warning signs of suicide in youth or in numbers that can be called or protective factors that are put in place. And so I would say, if your interest is engaged and if you feel that tug of needing preparedness or wanting more information, to please seek that out, as well as engaging in the story that we're going to tell together.
Yeah. So, and I appreciate that. And I appreciate your willingness to come have a hard conversation, because in this discussion we were having a couple of weeks ago about some of the tragedies in our area when it comes to young people and suicide, and certainly beyond. As I've had meetings across the state the last month, youth suicide is sadly a common reality in almost every community I talk about. And we were having this conversation, and you and I have spent enough time together now, sadly almost all virtually, that I can start reading sort of where you are and sort of your feelings and how you're doing. And I could see heaviness in you as we were talking about this. And then you said, this is this is feeling heavy on me. I'm feeling a sense of urgency to really do something about that. You and I'd had conversations prior to that, but in that conversation, I could feel your deep and personal connection to the story we were talking about, the challenges we were talking about. And so I'm going to let you talk to us now a little bit about your personal connection to youth suicide.
Sure. So as you mentioned, we were speaking about just, we hear in our job, we hear about tragedies often, and that's something that I've had to sit with and to understand in a professional level, if that's even possible, as we have. But also that day that you were speaking about, I was sitting and I was feeling that urgency was coming from this multi-perspective lens that I felt like I had as someone who was now in an office of prevention with the state. And that was a new role to me. But I was also, and it's something that I wasn't sure that I should carry into a field, a profession in working in mental health and hopefully working in psychology. But I've understood now that I think that people learn the most, not from your successes, but from your failures, and I think, or from your hardships. And so stepping into that sort of power that I've found in myself and in getting comfortable with my own story and my own personal experience with being a survivor of a suicide attempt at an early age, that was something that I've had to sort of weigh with myself and see, where does that come? What can that teach me? And more importantly, what can I learn to be an advocate for those who are in that experience currently? And it's complicated because I think that I went through what I did at a very young age, as a child, a very early teenager, that feels entirely separate from me now when I talk about this and when I talk about sort of my story. And it feels like I'm telling the story of a person. It doesn't feel like myself in ways that can feel inauthentic. I think it can feel a little bit of judgment to myself, of memory being hazy, or feeling like I'm sharing someone else's story. But the truth of that is that it was something that I did go through. And that child, that young girl, that teenage girl, I think she worked really hard for me to be able to tell her story. So in a lot of ways, what I experienced feels separate. But when I sit and I hear stories, and like we just shared, when I hear of someone that has passed from completed suicide, it feels that weight is something extra that's there, of that weight of, I feel that sort of just pull, and that pull to ask these questions and to engage in these conversations in a really kind of deep way that I think everyone feels when they hear that that's happened.
When you say you were really young, how old were you, Marrin?
14.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And, I know a question out there that not just parents, adults in general, who are struggling really to understand when we see the numbers rising of young people taking their life. A lot of folks will ask, what is so challenging going on in that young person's life? They're only 14 years old. How in 14 years does a young person get to this place of such hopelessness and despair that they would attempt to, or successfully take their own life? And I'd be curious how you would respond to that.
Yeah, I think that's, again, something that I've had to sit with and kind of with kindness wrestle with in myself, of asking myself that question coming out of it, of how did that get that way? How did I feel that way? And I think that it's something that I feel like as an adult, I also ask that about myself. I have that block of, well, how did that happen? Because even as myself, I really don't have that answer. It's something I've tried to kind of label and identify in myself for a long time, and getting comfortable with the fact of that there was this urgency of hurt, and it was not brought on by any particular event or long-standing kind of hardship. I grew up in, I'm extremely privileged and lucky of the support systems that I have in my life. Have a wonderful family. I had a wonderful network of community and friends, and I was still dealing with a hurt and a type of depression at that early age that I did not have the tools to understand. And in that sense of just complete and total urgency, I felt like I was out of options. And so I would say that um, that is what I've taken as my takeaway, is that, no matter what was, I don't have a pinpoint for an origin, but I do know that I felt completely out of options. And I think that is the common denominator between the vast amount of regions, motives, and risk factors that can happen in youth suicide. Is there is a moment of a decision of, I feel like I'm out of options. And I think that is what is so important. And that is the kind of hot iron to strike, is to make sure that someone never feels like they're out of options, regardless of what has gotten them to that point. I hope that answers your question and sheds a little more.
Yeah. And so the audience, I'm sure, follow up would be to that. What are some of those ways then, whether it be in a family setting, whether it be in a friend's circle, whether it be in a greater, sports team circle, school circle, what are just some of those things? And again, owning and recognizing that everybody's path to I'm out of options looks different, but what are some of those generally protective things we can do around young people to make sure they know they're not out of options?
Mhm. I think that I think you'll like my answer. I think it's what answer we come to in, our department and in talking about childhood adversity in a whole. But I think that truly making sure that every youth that is dealing with a mental health issue or not dealing with one, because whether it's been identified or not, of course, people are going to struggle and face hardship. And even if a student, a youth, a child, a teenager is not dealing with something as acute and traumatic as depression, it doesn't matter. We all need someone in our lives. And that's going to be my answer, is make sure that if they make that choice to look behind them and one more time and say, okay, let me see if anybody's is asking, or if anyone can hear me or can help, that there's somebody standing there. That is, I would say that's the answer, is make sure that there are people, that someone has a person, that everyone has someone to look out for. And in that is a lot easier said than done when you were talking about youth mental health. And that is, there a lot of fear and a lot of discomfort has to be kind of white knuckled or grit through sometimes when you're trying to be a support system for someone that is struggling with something on a human level. That's complicated, especially when it's someone that you may not have that relationship with. And that comes with information, that comes with knowledge, that comes with equipping yourself with understanding warning signs of mental health struggles in young people. But it also comes with human courage that I think we'll be speaking about a little bit more, not on the clinical signs and what to do as a supporter, which is equally as important of a part of the recipe, but that courage to be that person that might have a challenging conversation, that is a protective factor entirely in itself.
Yeah, I could probably like spend the next 3 hours just talking on that piece right there. You said something the other day when we were kind of talking about this discussion, and it was powerful to me. It has stuck with me. You like, and not just your challenge, but just in general, the challenge of young people and all of us when we start to face mental health challenge, this idea of becoming untethered. And by untethered, that means untethered from a meaningful relationships. Um, and that was the first thing you just talked about. And this idea of, a lot of the work we do, research shows us that our young people, whether they are apparently well or whether they're struggling with a mental illness, and I would argue that line between well, perceived well, and mentally unwell gets tighter and tighter all the time. Like, and I think what you said, and I'm glad you said it, is the power and need for relationship isn't isolated for the folks who are struggling with mental illness. And we do presentations where we talk about if somebody's facing a whole lot of struggle in their life, young or old, yet has somebody meaningful in their life, their mental health and physical health outcomes are likely to be much better than somebody who's seemingly doing well, but has nobody in their life to turn to. So, and you're right. I'm fond to say relationship. And from a personal standpoint, I would say that, my role as a dad looks a little bit different today than it did, just a little over a year ago. And because of that, like I'm not present with my two boys who are 13 and 15 as much as I'd like to. But it's become more important to me that they have other male authority figures, role models, whatever you want to call it, in their life. Now, there would have been a time where I think maybe I was, whatever you want to call it, jealousy, or like somebody stepping in on my dad turf, like I'm the man in their life. I know more than ever that they can't have too many men or women in their lives that they can go to when times get hard. Because more and more, as much as I want them to feel like they can come to me, on a broader, more protective level, I just want them to feel like they can go to somebody, especially when it feels like, and I won't speak for you, but to me, I've had my own challenges. To me, running out of options is probably closely related to I'm running out of people to talk to. And if you start with not having anybody, which we know a lot of our kids today, that more and more evidence says if you ask kids, how many adults do you have in your life? If something gets really hard, you can turn and talk to right now. The most popular answer today is 0, which is a really scary, scary thing. And it goes back to the main protective factor you talked about when we talked about what's the best approach to somebody running out of options. It's a someone. So I just appreciate that answer. And I do want to dive into, I think the big hurdle to adults being, because there'll be a lot of adults who will say right now, listening to that, well, that's not true. Our kids have adults, they have teachers, well, here's the meaningful piece of that. Kids are thinking, who do I feel safe enough to go talk about the hard stuff with? Sure, there's plenty of adults that go talk about math, the football game the night before, but running out of options is preceded by some really hard stuff going on. So this is who can I go talk to about the really hard stuff. And I don't think, and then I'm gonna let you talk. I don't think this is a kid issue. I think adults have a really hard time entering into the hard conversations for a lot of reasons. I think hard conversations sometimes call us to help with something we don't feel equipped to help with. Hard conversations by nature are more uncomfortable to have than the easy, life is going good conversations. I think we, for a lot of reasons, and you know, you've heard me say it, that relationships is the answer. That's a hard answer, because the one thing we're all fairly generally bad at is relationships. I think the common denominator in that is that we want to build relationships on talking about the easy stuff, living through the easy stuff, and life ain't always easy. And so we have to have some capacity to enter into and have hard moments. So I don't know, what do we do? What did that look like, I guess, in your life too? Because you did talk a little bit about after the fact, like survival for you really was in a large way founded on folks close to you being afraid to go, or not being afraid to go where a lot of people might have been afraid to go. So what, if you know, to the degree you're comfortable talking about that, what did that look like in your life?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right that is, you know, on the surface, it feels like a small ask of just, well, be there for people, you know, don't leave people alone. But it's a big ask to go to someone and to be a person that a child or a student can, if they need to ask themselves, who do I trust with my fear? That's a huge question. And that goes beyond trust in a safety way. That's, who do I trust that can handle my biggest fear and face this overwhelming surge that I have no idea what it is? Who can take this with me? And I think that that's the real discomfort, is what comes from, in a lot of ways, not offering a complete plethora of being an expert on something, reaching out and being a support system, listening to someone that may be experiencing depression or suicidal thoughts is not about having every hotline memorized, understanding statistics, reaching out. It's important to understand those things, but it's also just active listening and engagement of saying, well, let's talk about it for a second. Tell me about, how are you feeling? And is there anything I can do to help you? I'm here for you. Just those sentences and those words, maybe you would be shocked at how many people haven't heard them in a long time. And I think that the complicated repetition is also something that is not our strong suit in relationships. If it takes courage to do something once and to look at something scary, which a young person in crisis, that's a scary situation. That's a word that a lot of us are using right now when we look at mental health in schools, is that's frightening. That is scary, those statistics going up. But having to look at that, oftentimes that's an over and over again thing. That is a repeated, I want you to know I'm here for you today. Tomorrow, I'm also going to be here for you. Next day, here for you too, because this is often not one courageous decision of being there for somebody once. And when someone's going through something like this, or when we talk about suicide, that is often I'm going to show up for you today, and I'm also going to show up tomorrow and the next day, and as many times as you need. And I'll repeat it as many times as you need to hear me too, because when someone is in such low of a spot, they might not even be in a place to digest that love and that support. And so showing up repeatedly is also a really important factor of that, and of being a support system for someone. And luckily, in my own personal experience, I had of so many people around me that repeatedly showed up, that stepped into that fear with me every day and said, I don't understand everything that you're thinking and feeling, but I also don't have to in order for what I'm saying to be true. And because what I'm saying is that you're supported and you're loved and you're here. And that's true no matter what is going on that I don't understand. And so that's a scary place, to not have the full story and to not be able to understand the full story of what someone's going through while still be completely confident in your answer. And luckily that was my family. They each morning they stepped into that. They stepped into, just as you said, being totally untethered with me, saying, okay, what are we going to face today? Because I have got no idea. I'm not going to pretend like I have an idea, but we're going to do it together as a unit and as a support system. And I'm so grateful and consistently lucky that I had family and friends who would be afraid with me and would still be completely solid in the fact that they were there and they were going to show up no matter what that looked like every day. And that was just so beneficial to me and to my health.
You say something. So again, a couple of things, as always happens in our conversation, you always get me thinking. I worked 13 years with at-risk kids in a residential wilderness program. I was a counselor, lived with these young people, and I hate the term. It's not really even appropriate anymore, at risk, because I think all kids are at risk. These were just young kids who, 13, 14, 15 years old, had faced a lot of challenges in their life that looked really different from some of the challenges other folks had faced. But my role was, and a lot of young counselors that were in that role with me, we lived with these young people 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And when you bring 10 young people together that have very challenging stories, some days that got really challenging looking. But what just stuck with me after you were just talking there, over the years since then, I've been gone from that for quite a while now, but over the years, I've had many of those young people reach out. Social media and technology is a gift when it comes to those opportunities. And they've reached out and they've said, Chief, and we were all called Chief back then. They said, I just want you to know that you saved my life. And so that's a powerful thing to hear from a young person. But I'd always ask, like, well, what did I do? What did I personally do to save your life? And full confession, there's some ego involved in that. Like, I want to know, like, what did I do to save your life? All of them, one way or another, different wording sometimes, but all of them, their answer was, you just kept showing up. In moments where everybody else had always bailed on me because I made this mistake, they kicked me out of school. I made this mistake, they kicked me out of the community. I made this mistake, they locked me up. I kept making mistakes and you just kept showing up. Now, the fact that they didn't recite some, life-changing speech I gave, the fact that they didn't, remember some sort of pivotal moment, it was simply this, what you just described, day after day. The night before, they cussed me out, they threatened to kill me, threatened to kill my mama, threatened to kill anybody and then I'd just be right there the next morning. And that was not always easy. Like, we're human. Like, when you face something hard like that in terms of aggression, like you have some anger involved in that. Or if you face something with them that's completely out of your comfort zone, like you don't even want to wake up out of fear, what's going to happen today with some of that. But you said something critical, Marrin, and I think, this is really important for adults, with kids to think about. I think it's really important in this age with us as people, with each other to think about this. The capacity to say these 3 words, I don't understand. I don't understand, but I'm here to try to understand. For how many young people hear that? Like, how many young people who are experiencing things, who are exhibiting things that don't look like, and I'm using my quote unquote, normal young person behavior, which I don't even know what that is. But we as adults sometimes seem to have some sort of bar or some sort of standard of what normal, again, quote unquote, young person behavior looks like. And so our first response a lot of times is to judge that as problematic, judge that as worrisome, judge that first before we take this step of, no, this is something going on here I don't understand, and that's okay. I want to try to understand it. What a powerful thing for a young person or any person to hear somebody say to them, you know what? It looks like you're going through a challenge. I don't get it, but I want to get it. And then you said something earlier too, and then I'm going to let you put something on that. You said something earlier that was really powerful to me. And you talked about reflecting back on this younger Marrin. You today, this young woman looking back on 14-year-old Marrin having these challenges. And you said some days I don't even recognize, that's like a different person. And you talked about how you sort of bridge that gap by looking back on her with kindness. You look back on these challenges she was facing. And I think there's such a, if you start talking about recipes, if you could have a general recipe for interacting with young people and with people in general, just this idea of, with kindness, looking at someone with a challenge and being willing to say, I don't understand, but I want to.
Mm-hmm.
I think too often our initial response is, you're kind of out of line with what I see as normal or acceptable. So my motive is, or my approach is, I need to help you better understand my way. And I think that has been a failed approach on many levels. So I'm going to let you, I know you.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you. And I mean, even on a professional level, even the most written up practices in trauma-informed care, in crisis intervention, nowhere on those lists of how to start to approach someone that is struggling does it say, first, you have to struggle with what they did in order to know what to do. Talk about the recipe of what's never possible or should be, is we should never, you can't endure the gravity of what someone else has, and you shouldn't have to in order to be able to properly support them. And I think that that's huge, because what that's doing is that's asking someone to, in a trauma-informed school lens, in a clinical lens, or a personal lens, that's first asking empathy to come up, which is something that I think a lot of people don't see as scientific, as empirically based, as grounded in research, but it is over and over. Whether or not that word is used, that's what we're asking first. When you can label it as whatever you'd like, as active listening, collaborative action, a protective system, a trauma-informed lens, all of those words just mean, take someone where they are and listen to what they're going through, be able to try and understand. I haven't been in your shoes. I have no idea what it feels like to be experiencing what you are. And that's true no matter how close your story is or how much it lines up. My own personal history with mental health issues, I still have to approach someone who's also experiencing that with the same amount of empathy, because our stories are going to be so different. But take the kindness that you've built, come at it with where they are, and just listen. And I think that's huge. And I think that's a first step that a lot of people get wrong, which is, we could talk about that for a long time too, but just that discomfort of, I don't have the answers, so how can I be there for someone when I don't know? But you don't have to know. And that's the important part, is as much as we like to, and as much as especially I think in our culture today, as much as we feel like we need to be experts about something before we represent or before we step up, I think it's something that's really important when you deal with something critical and something, a sense of urgency like youth mental health or about suicide is, I don't know everything yet, but that's not going to stop me from showing up and from listening to you with empathy. And I think that's the key to that recipe that you're talking about.
Yeah, and empathy's an interesting word. You know, we talk a lot about this work you and I do together, and many across our state, trying to help communities become more trauma informed, which really at the heart of that is the science of empathy is what, you know, we constantly call it, the science of empathy. But, you know, I think this empathy and kind of what's standing in the way of sort of this mass empathy, you know, a lot of people know empathy is sort of this willingness to step into somebody else's shoe. Like sympathy is being able to feel like the struggle somebody is having in those shoes. Empathy is this capacity to be able to like step in them and walk in them, because that's truly where you start to gain understanding. But I think there's like this hurdle even before that when it comes to empathy. And that's, I don't know how best to say it, but we lack sort of this curiosity about someone else's shoes. We lack this sort of desire to understand somebody else's shoes. And again, it goes back to some of the conversations we've had. I think some of that is a fear. Like, I think we can see those are challenging shoes. I'm kind of afraid to step into them. I think sometimes if you're willing to step into somebody's shoes, then you're going to own some responsibility. Once I know how challenging these shoes are to walk in, I just can't walk out of them as a loving, kind human, and leave them in those shoes as they were. I just walked in them, gained this sense of empathy, and now I know. Now I truly feel. I always talk about, you know, I went to Honduras, and I always talk about poverty. You know, here in this country, you can read a lot about poverty. You can gain an understanding of poverty. Go spend a week in Honduras, and you're suddenly in the shoes of it. And it's a really different experience when it comes to empathy. You come back home with a different sense of responsibility to those shoes those folks are walking in. And so I continually, like, when I hear these growing numbers, and, you know, I had a call earlier this week with a superintendent of a public school system here in Virginia, and we brought up youth suicide, and his voice was cracking. Like, he was cracking because of the emotion he felt of what was happening then and now, and cracking when he started talking about his fears of where it's going. And I don't know how. Like, my challenge, and I hope this conversation somehow stirs people to want to come beside our young people and say, I don't understand. I don't, but I want to, and I'm going to be here. Repetition, like you said, I'm going to keep showing up every day. If nothing else, you will sense this desire I have to be in your shoes, not a capacity to be in them, but this endless, relentless desire to be in them, to try to understand, to let you know you're not out of options. Like, I am one. I am an option. I don't know.
Right. And yeah, I mean, I agree. And I think that having those conversations, and when we talk about what's going on right now, and like that you were having with that superintendent and on that system level, I think that that's huge. But I also think that it's a harder ask, but I think it's important to not just have that conversation with adults. You know, I'll tell you, if I think back on my own experiences 7-8 years ago, I think that on a larger level and on the systems that I was able to benefit from getting professional help after the fact, from being allowed to have absences in school at such a young age because I had those policies that were put in place to protect my mental health. That's huge and very important. But in that critical point, the adults that talked to me, directly to me, not about me on a system level, but those who approached me and spoke to me, that is what really came into my life at a critical time. And so I think that we have to get comfortable talking to young people and listening to young people too. That's huge. Not, taking a moment, if we're collectively as a culture afraid but surprised at the level of amount that youth suicide is increasing, maybe we have to take a moment to open that dialogue in a scary way, in a controlled and safe way, but in a way of speaking to youth about, well, what's going on? What are you feeling? And I think that taking a moment to trust in people, regardless of age, and to trust someone where they're at by saying, let's talk about this for a second. I have resources that I can give you. I have support to offer you, but first I got to know what's going on. Like, can you trust me with that? Because I trust you to tell me as well. It's a two-way street. You can't ask a young person to trust you with their deepest fear and what they're going through without trusting that they can tell you. And so I think that's huge. And I think that we have to start, listening and also working together. And like you said, I hope that engagement happens and that collaborative force can happen soon as we start to enter this age that has school administration afraid, that has parents afraid. But I think that fear is not something to step away from. It's something that we all have to step into, because that's where change happens, when we are most, I feel like, afraid, and choosing that and stepping into that. I think that's huge.
Let me ask you, because you've said this 2 or 3 times now, and you and I could probably do a half-day training just on this one topic of relationships. But I think one of the challenges, when I say we're all bad at relationships, and like I said, I throw me in there. Like, I'm not trying to point fingers at anybody. I think generally we all are. One of the main, I think, challenges we have, as we are all much more comfortable with talking than listening. And so even when we are listening, sometimes we aren't even good at it. Like, we don't practice listening enough. So if I were to ask you, like, through the eyes of eyes, heart, mind of a young person, or, I mean, any of us really, what does a good listener look like? What is a good listener doing? And maybe the better word is, what is a healthy listener doing?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that's something that's, it's changed for me personally, very much so, and it will continue to change. And I'm comfortable with that. I think that I'm kind of a highly sensitive person. I'm also a fixer and a solver. And so I think as I started to, as I started college, I started to listen, but I wasn't listening. I was trying to solve. And I think that when we are afraid, I think that's our natural instinct too, is to say, this makes me really uncomfortable and I'm really scared, so I'm going to fix it right now. So tell me, and I'm going to listen, but I'm actually going to be thinking of solutions the entire time. And that's something I had to be really intentional about in my own personal life, in my relationships, is taking a step back and saying, I'm not being a supporter right now. I'm trying to fix. And that's not what's being asked of me. I'm trying to listen and to hear. And I can't hear if I'm trying to problem solve while someone's speaking to me. And so I think that has been, that's a journey in itself.
Yeah.
We want to help, and that want to help is a piece of it, but also what has to come before that is that true listening. And that knowledge of, as you were talking about, when we talk about empathy, there's this connotation that your perception might change. And if you're comfortable with where you are in life and your truths and what you know, real listening is challenging because it might change your beliefs and it might change and challenge your truth. And I think that that's complicated. And we are seeing that so much, I think, culturally right now is, are you willing to have what you believe is core foundation and belief, is that willing to be questioned? Are you willing to still listen to someone that doesn't have that similar belief as you? And if the answer is no, then why? And how can you approach it differently or more true? And so I think that's what that looks like for me, is that not coming at a place to immediately solve, but to first say, I don't know your problem yet. So if I have a solution before I've even heard the whole story, clearly it's my solution and it's not really for them. And so really understanding someone's mind and someone's experience, that comes first, because if I have any sort of preloaded answer before I've listened, it's not the answer because I don't know the question.
Right. And that's such a powerful answer. And so my tip to somebody would be, here is a piece of advice I would give somebody, because I do think it's applicable across the board. If you are interested in listening to someone, if you believe us when we say our young people really, what they need most is somebody who will listen to them. And if you are interested in being a listener who is going to be a healthy influence on that young person, the second you feel yourself trying to solve the problem they're talking about, you are becoming an unhealthy listener. That is what I would say. And so stop because of the reason you said, like, if you haven't fully listened to their problem, any solution you're coming up with a bad one anyway, because you're not fully informed about. So it's just stop for you and for them. And I think you and I have heard, we've had hundreds of conversations with audiences and people we talk to. One of the freeing things I'll add to that for folks, I'm giving you permission not to come up with a solution. I'm giving you permission when you hear yourself thinking, I got to solve this. I'm going to give you some great news. Like the young person talking to you, or the adult talking to you, your spouse talking to you, your friend talking to you, when they're talking to you, what they really want is someone just to listen. They aren't even wanting it. They're as aware as you are that this is there may not be any solution in the here and now. What I need most right now is just somebody to hear it. And maybe this will resonate with your 14-year-old story, but I hear it all the time and I believe it. Like one of the things that can make our young people feel like I'm running out of options is that no one really listens enough to their challenge to help them believe this is a real challenge. Because when somebody listens to it and somebody gets to say, this is my struggle, and somebody listens to it with kindness and a willing to try to understand it, it becomes real. And when a problem becomes real, it suddenly feels solvable. So many of our young people feel like this problem they have isn't valid, isn't real. And so when you get to feeling that, what options are there? Like if my problem isn't even real, it's not something that's ever existed before, who could possibly have a solution to that? So just hearing people in their life willing to listen, willing to say, I don't understand that, but I know it's hard on you, and so I want to hear more about it. There's a liberation on both sides of that conversation that starts to happen if someone's brave enough to enter into it.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that's such an important part of this conversation that I'm so glad that you brought up, because I mean, for me personally, I was so fortunate to have support systems that had that trust in me and that believe when I said this feels bad and I feel bad, that they said okay, and they listened immediately. Because it wasn't until, I was out of what I experienced personally and I started to just kind of witness and hear other experiences as a community member, but also as someone who wants to pursue this professionally, that that's not guaranteed and that there are so many young people who do ask for help and are returned with you don't need it. And that's talk about frightening. That's frightening, is when, what do you do when we talk about listening and the right way to listen, but what comes with that is first acknowledging there's something to listen to, and that's huge. And just that moment of saying, for me personally, I, on paper, when you talk about the children you worked with on, at your position, and when we talk about in our department adverse childhood experiences, on paper, I was a clean slate. I was check plus plus plus. I had everything. I had a support system of friends, of family. I had good grades. I had support systems. I was on a sports team. I had all these protective factors, and I was doing fine. I was fine. And then all of a sudden I wasn't. And so I can't imagine how differently my story could have played out if I had said, I'm not okay. And then I gotten the response with, but you should be. So, and you are, like, you're fine. And so that's just huge, of understanding that, meeting people where they are, and first validating and saying, okay, if you feel that way, you feel that way. And I don't have all of the answers for how to get you out of that yet, but I'm going to hang here with you and find them with you. And the good news is that there are people who devote their whole lives to the answers. When we're talking about that, I don't have the answer, but I can listen. You don't have to have them. There are people and professionals, and you can get help for young people and for anyone to have that solution based that can come, but that support system and guiding somebody to those answers, that has to come first.
Yeah, no, and that's powerful. And I think it's always a healthy and safe thing, especially when it comes to this conversation, to err on the side of believing our kids. Like,
Yeah.
it's just believe them. Like, if they tell you that I'm struggling, believe them. And on the flip side, if you suspect there's something challenging going on, if it doesn't, you know, believe with caution and attention. Keep
Yeah.
keep following up with your kids. You know, I in response to some of the challenges in our local community here, I mean, I had breakfast with my 13 and 15-year-old here, a couple months ago, I guess it's been. And I'm going to tell you, like, to bring up these youth suicides with your two right there, it's a scary thing to ask. Like, what do you all know where you can turn if you start feeling some of these really hard feelings that you might not even understand? Have you ever felt any of these things on your own? The scariest thing about asking that question is they might say yes. That's and there's a discomfort in what do I do if they
Yeah.
say yes. That's that whole I have some obligation to solve. I think we need to push obligation aside long enough to say what my sons need most first is knowing that there's somebody there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, from a research standpoint, it's a common misconception that asking someone if they're experiencing depression or suicidal thoughts increases their risk, but over and over again, that's shown not to be true. And that, again, that misunderstanding of putting ideas in someone's head, that's shown not to be true. And that opening that dialogue in a safe, supportive, protective way is only positive and has only shown time and time again to open that conversation and to shed light on something that feeds in darkness. And so exposing something, but it won't grow it. It will shrink the power that it has. And so, ripping that curtain open and saying, hey, this is here. And I think that about this. I just want to check in and let you know that, I'm here to listen. If this is something you're dealing with, I'm noticing this and this. I just want to let you know I'm here. Or if you haven't at all, and engaging in those conversations, because I think especially as clinically, as ages start to get younger of people and young people that are experiencing this, that's a whole other conversation. But this acknowledgement that we can have these conversations in a healthy way as parents, as educators, as students, as people, is important.
I'm glad you brought that up, Marrin. I'm really glad. I think, back 30 years ago when I started in that role, working with, young people who are having a hard time, we were actually trained. Like, I'm not sure if it was official training, so I don't want to project anything, but we were certainly discouraged from ever asking a young person if they were thinking about suicide. For that very reason. If you ask them and they say yes, we suddenly have an obligation to do a lot of different things legally. You can't just have a young person say, I'm thinking about taking my life, without honoring some responsibilities in terms of, child protective services, all of those things from a clinical liability standpoint. And then, this other, and I guess the comfort we were given is that if you bring that up, it's just putting ideas in their head. They're going to say yes because they want the attention, and you've given them an idea how to get attention. Like, that's a 30-year-old way of looking at that. We now know, as you have said, with a lot of research to back it up, a lot of personal stories from folks who have battled this, that someone asking them if you are thinking about this doesn't put ideas in their head. It opens an opportunity for them to talk about something that may very well be trapped in there because they haven't found the right person to talk about. So, to your point, in a safe and loving and understanding, kind environment, when we're asking somebody that, there's a far greater chance that's going to be life-saving than it is going to be something that puts an idea in somebody's head that somehow wasn't there before.
Right. And I mean, even if we take that thought to the end and you say, okay, say you do bring this up for the first time for a child that hasn't heard this, wouldn't you rather they define it in that healthy and controlled setting than do it 6 months, a year later in an unhealthy and very harmful way? Wouldn't you rather them understand these concepts from a safe and a nurturing and a protective place, then they figure it out themselves, whether that's online, whether that's with peers in the dark without you knowing? And wouldn't you rather have that conversation? I think that's huge. And I also want to touch on something you said that I think is really important, is this concept of attention, which can come up a lot when we talk about youth mental health and suicidal thoughts or depression in young people. This concept of what can be, again, maybe a fear-based response, maybe not, if they're just doing it for attention. And in my own personal, if I look at myself and I look at that 13, 14-year-old who started engaging in self-harm behaviors, who started experiencing really quick onset types of depression, the answer was, of course I needed attention. Of course I did. Yes, I was attention seeking. Clearly I needed something that I wasn't getting. And so I think that that's also a huge barrier to overcome when we look at youth mental health, is this conversation of attention seeking. And right, what attention do they need? What's this margin of the correct kind of struggle that someone's going through, and who defines that? And if someone is not getting attention that they need, again, that's that step of coming to someone and saying, hey, are you okay? And if the answer is no, also being understanding that doesn't, you don't have to fix immediately. And that's saying, okay, let's go find someone together that can answer that for you, because that's, that next step in having conversations with youth about, I'm not the person that can heal that for you, but I do know resources that can help. So if you're in a school setting, walk with me to the counselor's office. Let's go together. I will meet you at lunch and we can go talk to somebody. I'll come and sit in a meeting with you. I have a phone number you can call. If you want to text someone, here's this number. Engaging in that. No, I don't know, but do you want to find out together? And I'll be there for you in that discomfort of trying to get resources. That's huge. And that's what my family did is, well, no, we've never dealt with this before. We suddenly have, this very young child in our household who's going through something just acute and horrifying. We have no idea, but we're going to wake up and not know together, and we're going to figure it out. And I'm going to be with you as we go through this process. And luckily there is support, and there is help outside of that initial, are you okay? And that's a big step. But I agree with you that this concept of attention, and that's valid still too. It all merits listening.
Right. Yeah. And, going back to your point about, even if we ask, right, are you having these thoughts? And they're not. I think what that really does is, I was thinking about it as a dad. Okay, well, now I'm far more comfortable asking it. Like, a lot of times it's just hard that first time asking that question. And from the young person's side of that, if that's not where they are today, I sure know where I can go have that conversation tomorrow. Because we already had it, even though turns out that wasn't the case in this moment. We've kind of set the stage for comfort and safety, because that's really what it's all about. That's why we don't have a lot of these conversations. For many, many reasons, we don't feel safe in those spaces to have the hard conversations. And I think part of that too, going off something you just said too, we all need to get over ourselves in this whole, I need to have the answers. We just need to I think it will start with that you really don't have them. None of us have all the answers. And more and more I say, like, the healthiest thing to do, the most successful thing to do, if you want to go over to a business model, isn't having all the answers. It's having better questions and knowing who to ask them of. And to your point, like, if a young person feels like I can come ask you questions and you're going to be comfortable enough to say, I don't know, but I know who we can go ask the next question. This idea, this pressure we put on ourselves, or sometimes it's not even pressure, sometimes it's ego, arrogance, all of those things. This, I need to have all the answers. It's serving nobody well, especially our young people. So before I sort of transition to a next line, I really want to ask you about, I just want to say, I appreciate your willingness to talk about that piece of your life. I know it's a hard one to talk about, but I know you too. You have a heart for giving and sharing, and your way of, I know, dealing with heaviness is maybe helping other folks deal with their own heaviness, or best case, prevent some of it. So I just really, really appreciate that about you. I want to say, or ask, or comment, or something that, like, so when going all the way back, when I was like stealing Marrin from one interview to be my interviewee. And by the way, I have not been asked to sit on an interview panel since then.
Yeah, you're a poacher. They're never bringing you
People
back.
are fearful to have me on there because I'll steal their interviewees. But I had no idea about any of this history, any of this particular part of your story. But it does make me curious, now. So like you said, you're a finishing up your degree at William Mary. You have a interest in, being going in this psychology path. Just last week, you interviewed, and we'll get it, but I won't go too far.
Fingers crossed.
A doctorate program at UVA. I mean, you really, and it comes out when you and I get to have these conversations together about childhood adversity, community resilience, relationships. Like there's a, and that's what came out in the interview. One, anybody listening to you now knows you're like wise beyond your years. You're incredibly bright. But what came out in your interview was the way you were able to apply what I didn't even know at the time, your experiences in life, to a helping sort of path with heart. You had this heart and passion that I connected with. So how much of the story you had as a 13 and a 14-year-old is serving as guidance for who you are now as a young 20-something plotting out her future? Where do those stories connect? I'm always curious about.
Yeah.
Because clearly it becomes more and more evident the Marrin we're looking at or hearing today is largely built on and influenced by teenage Marrin.
Mhm. Yeah, I think it's a good question. I think it's something that has ebbed and flowed as much as a foundation has. But I think that when I was younger, I wanted to be a writer. I wanted to be a full-time author. And I had that, hammered in my head. I said, okay, I'm gonna be a best-selling author. And I know that. And really all I was doing was I was in elementary school and I would read a very popular book, and then I would rewrite it into a journal and change all the names and be like, look what I wrote. And it was Harry Potter written 4 times over with different words and different names, but it made me feel better. So that was sort of my beginning. And I started to, after I kind of experienced what I did, and I started to understand that I was quickly developing like this story just in my life. It took me years of healing, and that initial sort of spark of a conversation it's what engaged my academic and my professional interest in psychology. Once I was past that person, once I was looking forward at graduating high school, I was wondering, okay, am I going to go back to writing? Am I going to go to journalism? What is this going to fall into? But really what I wanted to do was to hear people's stories. That's what I wanted to do when I was writing. And I wanted to tell stories and to understand the human experience. And that sort of developed into, okay, so I think I maybe want to do counseling, because I really enjoy hearing people's experiences and understanding how through each other we can better ourselves. And that became a conversation of, okay, maybe I want to go a counseling, a therapist route, which in the past was something that, okay, I have to cover up the fact that I went through what I did, because that is going to look like I have this sort of like helping complex or something that may be unresolved based on what I went through. But it really is separate. It's something that engaged me in, here's the importance of human interaction. And then professionally, I started to look forward in that of saying, oh, actually, I just want to kind of tell stories, and I want to hear people's stories. That's what that means. That's mine. But that's not what I want to use it for. That's my story. I'm happy to talk about it. And it actually has really graced me in ways to engage with people that tell me theirs. I think it opens doors of trust that I, went through something. Therefore, it's opened some of those dialogues for me, which I'm really extremely grateful for. But also, no matter what I've been through, it doesn't merit that you can't tell me yours. And so please do. And that's how that began. But then as I started to go into college, that storytelling and that curiosity, it started to get a little bit more scientific, and it started to get to, okay, so I'm really interested in human experience. And then I started to get into, how does that work? And that started to go into neuroscience and in, psychology and all of these factors, still with this root in myself of, of human story. And it's now developed into this strange part of our story is the way our brains work and the way that patterns happen in our psychology and how our worlds shape that. And so I still, as I'm shifting more to a kind of clinical psychology future, I still look at it as that's our story. Our brains are our pens. That's just how we write stories. That little young third grade self is still in there, and I am still connected to that young person and to that young hurting person as well as I was older and a teenager. But that's really how that affects me, is that interest in people's lives. And I think that's where it's rooted and where it's come from. And it's something I've had to grow comfortable with and see a strength in, that I can hold that in my profession and make space for it in a healthy way.
That's beautiful. You know, we have this sort of mutual love for writing. And as you were talking, I was just like shaking my head. Yes, yes. My love for writing, I know, comes from just this intense curiosity for people and their stories. And I do think a lot of that has come in the last 6 or 7 years doing this work that we're doing, because one of the most powerful things that happens, at least personally for me, that has happened as we've done this work, is you start to, one, understand your own personal story in a different way. You start to rewrite it in a way that maybe is a little more authentic and accurate in some ways. But then I have found the more you do that with your own story, the more you get curious about this person's story here and there. And once you start to understand the healing power of sort of reconciling or dealing with your own story, you become passionate about helping people who may think, again, I'm out of options. Well, just understanding your own story, especially, as we get to be adults, is a really powerful healing opportunity. So I appreciate, the path you're going down. Someday you and I may be writing a book together.
I hope so. That's the goal.
I think there's a lot of opportunity there. I want to talk about something else, because we've talked a lot about young people, and I think there'll be crossover here. There is more and more crossover with it. But one of the other things you are doing and pursuing is this, and I'm going to let you tell me what it is. Like, you want to be sort of this expert yoga person. Yoga's not my
Yes.
expertise, but talk to me a little bit about that, where that fit into this story you are living out, Miss Yoga Expert.
Hope that is hilarious. I would like to think so. Man, talk about being comfortable not knowing. That is my journey right now. I got into yoga sort of just as a side, this makes me feel good. And as I started to work at William and Mary and work at the wellness center here, I understood that word wellness is kind of capitalized now in a way, and it's been put as an industry. But for me, that looked at wellness. Okay, what are my fillers and what are my drainers, and looking at those, and then trying to really establish what can I come back to during the day, no matter what, that fills me. And to me, that was getting curious about yoga and about this concept of what started for me as going as a workout class, because I knew that moving my body felt good. I didn't know why. I didn't understand the science of endorphins and calming your central nervous system. But it began as a workout, and then I started to really get comfortable with not knowing more, and the gravity of what yoga held. And so I started to just practice myself, and I started to get a little bit more curious about the philosophy of yoga, what these things mean. And now I'm in the process of becoming a yoga teacher, a 200-hour registered yoga teacher. And again, it's something that has helped me so much. It's just become what I come back to of, okay, here's how I feel well. Here's what that means to me. Here's something that I can go back to that settles me during the day. And that brings me back to my why and the things that ground me. And that's been a path for me. It's something I hope to be able to, it was entirely separate from, it felt separate from this conversation that we had previously and what we're having about clinical work and continuing, but I'm learning slowly and also somehow all at once that I think it does hold space for me in my future career. I hope to be a yoga therapist and combine that with my clinical practice in my future, because I do feel that this concept of yoga, there's a misconception about what it means, but there's so much. You can look at it scientifically, you can look at it personally, physically, emotionally. And to me, it is a practice of, I'm going to show up for myself today and I'm going to look in. And it has really helped me in what you were mentioning about defining my story and being able to see myself and to see other people, because I think regulating myself has to come first before I can be that good listener, before I can show up for people. And so for me, yoga's my way of doing that. I know running is your way of doing that. In my past, it's been, writing, it's been weightlifting, it's been taking my dog for a walk. It's anything that makes me ground before I can approach the world around me. And so that's what that is currently looking like for me. But right now in practice, I woke up this morning and didn't do it. And I had 2 cups of coffee instead. So it is not perfect. And it is this release of judgment and of a journey of what that looks like. So it's ever changing, but it's just that thing that makes me feel good, which is,
and we'll go a little sciencey on folks a little bit, because and not in an in-depth level, but I mean, yoga, the word I heard you say a few times in there, like I'm thinking of the big concept of yoga, and I know it's very complicated, but more than once you said regulate. Like, I want to regulate myself. And I think that's really important for folks to know. Like, my running is the same as your yoga, under the umbrella of it helps me get myself regulated. Writing, the same thing. I am no more regulated in a day than I am the first couple of hours in the morning when I spend time writing, think about what I want to write, because it's just me in that moment. Everything else is completely shut out and quiet. And for folks to just understand at a very beginner level, you and I talk and teach all the time. Like, we come into this world as babies. Like, the very first second, we are so freaking dysregulated because we've just come out of this womb, right? And it was kind of dark in there and sort of quiet, and we were familiar with the rhythms in there that were going on, the heartbeat and all. And all of a sudden, we are in this bright world, all sorts of commotion going on around. It's completely foreign to us as a new human being. And the first responsibility, whether it be the nurse, the mom, caregiver, is to soothe, regulate that little baby. When a baby gets hungry in those earliest days, it's going to cry, and it's going to, new moms will say, cry and cry and cry. Yes, we're going to show up and feed them, but we're going to show up and feed them because we know that's going to regulate them. That's going to help them get back to this space of feeling calm. And that need in our life never changes, even, and not to minimalize it or reduce the the sense of urgency around a young person who's saying, I don't feel like I have any options, I've run out. I mean, really, they are just overly dysregulated. Like, they have no way of kind of getting themselves back to this even place. When you and I get upset, throughout the day, when we get dysregulated about something, we need to find this way. to
Yeah.
get ourselves back to this
Oh, yeah.
place of calm.
And yeah.
And I've thought about yoga differently. Like, I'm not out doing it now, but like yoga is not this, no more this hippy dippy thing like these weird married people are out there doing. Same about meditation. You know, the more I started listening with an open mind, coming to folks and saying, I don't understand yoga, but I want to understand, the more I gave people opportunities to talk about those things, the more it started sounding in my life like prayer. That's what it started sounding like. And I'm not going to project spiritual connotations on what anybody does, but that more and more, well, wait a minute, this place of go, be still, just sit there and listen, not take on all the elements of the world.
Right. Yeah. Well, I mean, if you want to look at it clinically or from what we've been speaking about, or from an intervention lens, let's put it really into practice as an example of, say you're standing in a school setting and your approach with a student who is just panicked. They are mid panic. They're one way. They're in flight mode. They're thinking, if they're crying, if you're sobbing, if someone approaches you at the highest state you possibly can, what is the thing that most people say first before you can talk to someone is, okay, take a deep breath. That's what we say, because when someone is that heightened, you can't suddenly, when someone's at their complete end of their rope, be like, let's talk about, you know, this and that, what our options are. The first thing you have to do is, okay, take a deep breath with me. That's pranayama yoga. That is breathing. That is coming to your breath. That's focusing. That's taking an inhale and an exhale that says like, okay, the world around me is still here. I feel the ground under me. I see you and I'm ready to hear you now. And hear you, that's depends on who you're listening to. That is very much like what you're talking about. We're speaking to that spiritually, professionally, in any way, but we do yoga all the time.
Yeah.
We just don't know.
And I was going to say, I've just learned something. I do yoga.
Yeah. I mean, really, I joke about it a lot. Ending a practice in vinyasa yoga, you end up in shavasana, which is a corpse pose. So it's just laying on the ground. And I do that all the time. So if you're just laying down, just thinking you're doing yoga, but it's true. And it's this way to regulate and to center, that's neurological, that's spiritual, it's personal. It's this, again, this open-ended, really interesting thing that I've found has come up with a lot of answers for me. But at the same time, it's not a one answer solution, which is oftentimes easier, as we talked about before.
Yeah. No, I wrote a little bit this morning about sort of the alternative to trying to escape the world is to go immerse yourself in the world. And I talked about running the other day, and I stopped and took a picture. Like it was early morning and there were these clouds over the lake and they were reflecting in the lake, and it was just beautiful. And I took a picture of it and I shared it on Facebook, and like all of these people just started, that's beautiful, that's beautiful, that's beautiful. I think we all kind of stop in our tracks when we're just still, when we focus on just some moment in time. And when we're doing that, like at least for a moment and sometimes longer, all of the stuff in the world that we're trying to escape, you know, we're really not escaping it. We're just quieting ourselves and focusing on something that in that moment was really beautiful. And I think we all have those spaces, those places we can go to. They just, you know, they get lost in some of the noise sometimes. So any practice we have to kind of quiet ourselves long enough to know, you know, we have those places.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. And I mean, I think that when we talk about mental health, that's huge, is find a place of focus, not of numbness, which is something that can also be supplemented pretty easily. And that's easier sometimes, especially when you're enduring day in, day out turmoil or just loss. But find a place of focus. It doesn't have to be, you know, I think there's this negative connotation and we associate checking out with being numb, but being numb, whether that's just mindlessly scrolling on social media for an hour and that's your form of, self-care, whether it's substance use, whether it's disengaging with who you feel like you genuinely are, not to be confused with checking out, which is a great thing. Checking out's closing your social media, going outside, engaging with people around you, finding that thing that lets you check out of what you need to. And so I think that's huge. I think it looks different for everyone, but I think that exploring that and finding those things and that trial and error of what feels good for you is really exciting.
Well, Marrin, I have taken up a lot of your morning, so I want to start wrapping it up. I don't know if you have, and you and I will talk after this, and I will, put some resources together we can share as part of this conversation where I share it. But are there any big number one couple of resources you would tell folks, point folks to that are I don't understand, but I want to?
Yeah, I would say that the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline's a really good place to start. They have a lot of resources on if you really are, if this engages curiosity, I would say foundationally, it's really important to understand, here's the warning signs, here are things to look for someone that might be experiencing thoughts of suicide. And so approaching that, the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, the National Alliance for Mental Illness, NAMI, the National Suicide Prevention Hotline has just changed, which is really exciting now, to 988, which is a huge impact on, and I think that's a really great thing that's happening. That's something good to know. And we'll provide further resources for sure.
Well, I am grateful for you. I've been looking forward to this conversation as I was getting closer to wrapping it up, and we almost started to tiptoe over into the arena of numbing and addiction and kind of where that plays in this. I'm sitting here thinking, you know what? I think Marrin is probably going to be a regular sort of guest.
Yeah, I don't want to just be the first to start me off. I would like to have a seated position. You're poaching me again in different ways.
I think you're going to be a frequent part of this conversation. So, but with that said, this conversation was a great place to kick it off. And, I just want to say, I know a lot of folks may be listening that this does hit home too. And, that's a hard thing for people. We're living in some challenging times. So, I just encourage people any way we can, find your safe person, find those safe places, find the courage to enter into conversations that may be hard, but may be really healthy for both parts. I know that when I had that conversation with my boys that was hard, there was a sense of feeling healthier on my end too, just being able to enter into it. So I think we both recognize that. And hopefully this will be a story, conversation that can, to your point, be a resource, and Marrin will be back.
It's decided I will be, and thank you for having me and giving me the space way back in that interview to explore these things and to enter this work in a way that I didn't expect for myself in my future timeline. And it's opened so many doors for me already, and I'm so grateful for it on that level, but also to talk to you this morning.
Yeah, well, your future is bright, so that's why I stole you. So anyhow, I appreciate you.
Well, I hope after listening to that, you know now why I so admire Marrin Scalone. Well, I'm really grateful to have her working with me on some of the efforts we're doing across the state of Virginia around trauma-informed care, around adverse childhood experiences. I hope, though, as you listen to our conversation, those sort of taglines, ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, trauma-informed care, I hope you can hear us sort of boiling that down to the importance of relationships, the importance of connections with one another, and not just connections, but good, healthy, meaningful connections. And, we talked a lot about what those look like, and they are really, really critical for our young people. I think, as Marrin said, there's a lot of folks struggling right now to find that one adult that they can go have that hard conversation with. So I hope as you listen to it, maybe as a parent, maybe as an adult who has young people in their life, I hope maybe you found this helpful. My bigger hope is that you found it maybe hopeful, because there is a lot that we can do to promote the overall health and wellness of our young people. So just thanks for coming along and listening. I hope you'll go check out weatheringtogether.com. It is a new community, like I said, just starting it, but there will be a lot coming in the days and months and years ahead. I hope that will promote relationships both outside of this small community I hope to develop, but just outside of it as well. There are no ends to the need we each have for meaningful connections in our lives. So I hope you'll come back next time and listen in to the Weathering Together podcast. I will, as Marrin said, will share resources connected to this conversation wherever I share this podcast. So y'all have a great, great day. And thanks again for coming and listening to our conversation at Weathering Together.
When the day turns